Ariel, thank you so much. And those of you in village preservation, what a wonderful, wonderful resource you have in Ariel Cates. It's been such a pleasure to get ready for this, working with Ariel. What a
Thank
delight.
you.
Yeah, and Ariel even encouraged me to begin by holding up the book so that you can realize there actually is a book. In case you don't believe the slide that you're seeing, here's the book. There actually is a book. It costs $29.99, and and it's beautiful. It's a beautiful thing. I had nothing to do with making it beautiful. Good publisher, good graphic designer, all in the UK. Um, so this is the North Atlantic cities. You've probably heard people talk about European cities and American cities and Asian cities. You probably never heard people talk about North Atlantic cities, and I haven't either. But I didn't invent the North Atlantic cities, but I think I discovered them. And like most people who discover things, like say Amerigo Vespucci, I get to name it. But unlike Amerigo Vespucci, I decided not to name it after myself. The Charlie Duff cities wouldn't go. But the North Atlantic cities. I would like to add a four-word phrase into the English language. The North Atlantic cities. These are cities that have so much in common, so much that they can learn from each other. These are cities that have been going through a great common enterprise of North Atlantic trade and migration and city building for more than 400 years. And they're very different from other cities. They're our cities. New York is one, Baltimore is one. Well, enough. Let's get about our business. Needless to say, the clicker never works when it's supposed to. You're in New York. Most people think of New York as a city of skyscrapers, and frankly, who can blame them? But if New York didn't have skyscrapers, people might think of New York as a city of row houses. The North Atlantic cities, if you want to know whether your city is North Atlantic or not, the question you ask yourself is, does my city have row houses? And your city has row houses and originally had virtually nothing but row houses. And if your city didn't have skyscrapers, people would think of New York in the same breath as London and Amsterdam as the three greatest row house cities in the world. I live in a row house city too. This is what I see when I walk out of the front door of my house, which I do frequently. Um, the row house cities are a family that you find on the East Coast of the United States, but not just there. But I grew up in the city where I live, in Baltimore, and I got used to the fact that there were lots of row houses in Baltimore. There are lots of them. I would go and visit aunts and uncles in Washington in a neighborhood called Georgetown. There were lots of row houses there too. Washington, in many ways, was different from Baltimore. It had the White House, for instance, and the Smithsonian. But in another respect, it was very similar. It was a row house city, felt like home. Every now and then, we would head north and visit Philadelphia. Philadelphia had the Franklin Institute and the Liberty Bell, and those were things that Baltimore and Washington didn't have. But Philadelphia felt like home. It had row houses. I wasn't widely traveled when I was growing up, but when I was 20, I got the opportunity for a junior year abroad, and I wound up in London. Again, London in some respects is different from American cities, particularly when you're trying to drive a car. Very different. But in another respect, London felt just like home. London is a city of row houses, like so much of New York and like so much of Baltimore, Washington, and Philadelphia. What did I think about that? Well, frankly, I didn't think anything about that because every city I had ever seen had lots of row houses. I thought that's what a city was. But then the next summer, I got on a little boat with a couple of friends and wound up here about 5 hours later. Hope I don't need to tell you that's Paris. It's hard to say anything about Paris that is original. People have said just about everything that you can say about Paris, but I think I'm going to say something that I've never heard anybody say about Paris. Maybe you haven't either. You ready? Paris does not have row houses. I don't think anybody's ever said that about Paris before. You heard it here. Paris just may be the most beautiful city in the world. If you think that, I won't argue with you. But it's not a city of row houses. It is a city of apartments and apartment houses. And it was the first city of apartments and apartment houses that I had ever been in, other than some parts of your city, New York. But Paris is nothing but apartments, nothing but apartment houses. And it was the first inkling I had that there were cities that were different from London, Philadelphia, Washington, Baltimore, Greenwich Village, that were vastly different. And as I wandered around continental Europe, I found that virtually all the cities of continental Europe were cities that were like Paris. They had apartments, high residential densities, and brilliant street life. And boy, does Paris have brilliant street life. And the cities of Europe in general have high densities, small apartments, brilliant street life. They're a type of city very different from what I grew up being used to. Then when I was 23, I got on an airplane and I went to the American Heartland for the first time in my life. First time I'd ever gone across the Appalachian Mountains. If you were a live audience, I would ask you, which city is this? I've shown this to a number of live audiences, and I love the answers that people give. They've given me the names of just about every American city west of the Appalachians. Some people think it's Chicago. I can't find the lake, but somebody thought it was Chicago. St. Louis, Indianapolis, Minneapolis, name Annapolis. It turns out to be Houston. But what's really important is that several intelligent, well-traveled audiences have looked at this and they haven't been able to tell which city it was. And that shows that this Houston, Texas is typical. It has a bunch of skyscrapers in the middle, very big skyscrapers in Houston, 80 stories tall in the middle. But as soon as you get out of that skyscraper downtown, it looks kind of like Arlington National Cemetery. And the people live in bungalows and four squares and freestanding houses. This is a typical house in the Greenwich Village of Houston, their great historic district, or they call it their Brooklyn Heights. And it has a density of about 5 units to the net acre. So, you know, if you live in Paris, you have a small apartment and brilliant street life, same in New York. If you live in Houston, you have a nice house, you can go barbecue in the backyard. What kind of street life do you have? I asked Mr. Google, Mr. Google, Houston street life, and whoops. Here's Houston street life. That's the first picture that came up. So it turns out that there are 3 totally different ways of building a city in what we call the Western world. You can have small apartments and brilliant street life like Paris and frankly, New York. Or you can have large, low density houses and no street life at all, like most of the United States. Or somewhere in between, you can live like this. If you live here in Georgetown in Washington, you can have a nice house, kind of like a house in Houston. It's shaped very differently, but it's pleasant to be in. I'm in such a house now. Nice, you can have lots of space, it's sunny, and you can entertain at home, but you can still have street life. You can't have it on every block as Paris and New York do, but you can have it within 4 blocks of every house. Here is a picture of street life, Mr. Google's first pick for Georgetown street life. And this street life is 4 blocks away from the houses I just showed you. So here are 3 ways of building a city. The apartment way, the sort of suburban around skyscrapers way, and then the city of row houses, the city like London, the city like Washington, the city like Brooklyn Heights. So I decided, I want to know why this is so. I can't be the first person who ever noticed it. I eventually realized nobody else had ever written a book about it. So I decided I would do it myself. And I originally thought, I'm going to call this the Row House Cities. But then I realized I couldn't do that. I married a woman from New York. And she doesn't call them row houses. She calls them, you know what she calls them. She calls them brownstones. All my cousins-in-law call them brownstones. So, and the British call them terraced houses. Most people, there's no common word for them. So I thought, well, I can't name the book after the houses. What is it that really shows what it is that the cities of the row house world have in common? Well, it turns out that you find row house cities on the two coasts of the North Atlantic Ocean. We're used to our middle Atlantic coastline from Richmond, Virginia on up to New York, with a little bit of Boston and a little bit of Savannah. And that's the row house region of the United States. And it goes back as far west as Pittsburgh and a little bit of Cincinnati and St. Louis. But there's a row house region on the other side of the ocean too. London's in it. So is every city in the UK. So is every city in Ireland. So is every city in the Netherlands, even cities in Belgium, with a couple of outliers in North Germany and coastal France. This turns out to be a completely coastal phenomenon, this way of building cities. As soon as you go inland in Europe, you've got apartment house cities like Paris. As soon as you go inland in North America, you get sprawling cities like Houston. So somehow this ocean, which appears to divide the two halves of the row house world, must be something that unites them. And it turns out it was, because the people who built the row house cities turned the North Atlantic Ocean into the greatest trade routes in human history and the greatest routes of migration, voluntary and involuntary, in modern history, maybe since the fall of the Roman Empire. And so I thought, why not call these cities after what it is that they have in common, the thing that helped to shape them, and they are the North Atlantic cities. I didn't invent them, but I did discover them, and they're there, and they're important. Well, it turns out, hold on, row houses descend from houses that look like this. This is a drawing that was made in London in about 1600. This is Shakespeare's London. I apologize for the quality, but my hand was a little shaky back in 1600. I didn't draw very well. I wish I could apologize for the quality of the houses as well. These are big houses. These were the houses of rich Londoners in 1600. And like row houses, they're tall and narrow. But by the standards of their day, they were not architecture. Fancy architecture in Britain didn't look anything like this. And by all standards, they were poorly built. They were built like shacks. They were built of wood and outdoor plaster. And these are materials that rot and flake. And London is a damp, cold climate. These houses were falling apart much of the time. And if you don't believe me, look at this picture. You'll see that there's an alley between two of these houses. And if you look up at the third floor level, you'll see what looks like a log running at a diagonal across that alley. Well, it was a log. And if you ask yourself, why did somebody haul a log up to the third floor level and sling it across an alley from one house to another? The answer is to keep these very poorly built houses from falling apart. London had a few noblemen who lived in town palaces, but most Londoners lived in shacks. And so did almost everybody, all the common people in the cities of Northern Europe, north of the Alps, as late as 1600. So a miserable, miserable way to live, a miserable way to build cities. Somebody had to figure out how to turn the tall, narrow house of middle-class urban Europeans into architecture with a capital A that would satisfy the artistic ambitions of people. And somebody also had to figure out how to build these houses of durable materials so you wouldn't need to sling logs across alleys to prop them up. Who did that? Whoops. The Dutch did that. Here are some of the first row houses in the world. They're in Amsterdam. What's remarkable about them? Two things. One is they have magical architecture. They're treated as Baroque architecture. This is the 1600s. And you find all kinds of things in the architecture of Italy and France, on palaces and in churches, and you find it in Holland on row houses. The other remarkable thing you find, they're made of brick. They're not going to fall down. You don't have to run a log from one to another. These houses are almost 400 years old, and they're still standing strong, and God willing, they'll be here 400 years from now. The Dutch invented what we think of as the row house. And when you walk around Greenwich Village and see row houses, you say, well, you know, this place did used to be called New Amsterdam, didn't it? Well, yes. Lucky for us, the Dutch didn't just invent the row house. They invented the row house during the golden age of Dutch art. The generation that invented the row house was the generation of Rembrandt or the generation of Vermeer. And why is it that Dutch art is magical? What's revolutionary about it? Well, the same thing that's revolutionary about their architecture. Look at Vermeer's painting here of a girl with a pearl earring. Who is she? Well, nobody knows. We know so little that people can make up stories about her, write novels, make movies. Is she somebody famous? No. Somebody rich? No. Was this portrait commissioned? No. Is she showing off? Is she dressed in diamonds and furs? No. What made Dutch painting revolutionary was that the Dutch painters showed that ordinary, everyday people could be beautiful and fascinatingly interesting. And that is what Dutch builders did in the same generation. Dutch builders were the first people, let's get this, who ever figured out how to take the houses of ordinary people, not just rich people in palaces, not just fancy chateaus or something, but the houses of normal, ordinary city people. The Dutch were the first people who figured out how to make them beautiful and how to do it at a price that ordinary people could afford. And best of all, how to weave them together into entire, beautiful, wonderful, walkable cities. Dutch cities are, for my money, the pleasantest in the world. I love walking around other people's cities. There are no cities that I love to walk around as much as Dutch cities. Here's Utrecht, but could be any one of them. I just adore it. And this is the birth of our way of building. If I showed you that picture in the context of a talk about the early architecture of New York, and I told you that this was Lower Broadway in the early 1800s, you might believe me. But there's a canal down the bottom of that picture. Ah, yes, there it is. No canal in Lower Broadway in 1800. This is a picture that was painted in Amsterdam in 1672. These houses were brand new when this picture was painted, and some of the houses haven't even been built yet. They're all there now, and you can go look at them, and are they ever beautiful? The Dutch invented our basic way of building. They invented the brick row house. Well, England isn't very far from Holland. And in the 1600s, the English and the Dutch were always sticking their noses into each other's business. They were trading with each other. They fought 3 naval wars. And by the end of the 1600s, the leading nobleman of Holland had become King William III of England. So the Dutch and the English were in very close community throughout the time when the Dutch were inventing the brick row house. And the first people who picked up on the Dutch innovation were the British, specifically noblemen and gentlemen in London. Here's St. James Square, probably the best address in London even to this day, laid out in 1672, the same year as that Dutch painting we were just looking at. Brick row houses, they have crossed the English Channel from Holland to London, and they come in as a fashionable import brought by court nobles who live in St. James Square. Well, it doesn't stay an affair of court nobles for long, because London burns down in 1666 and has to be rebuilt. Parliament instantly, within 7 weeks, passes an ordinance to govern the rebuilding of London, has the best building code I know. It's only 2 pages long, and it specifies that London has to be rebuilt as a brick row house city on the Dutch model. Here's the Great Fire of London. St. Paul's Cathedral in the middle is about to burn down. It burns down all of those wooden shacks. And within 7 years, London is rebuilt, and it looks like this. Here is London rebuilt, finished by 1674. And again, if somebody showed you this picture in the context of a talk about the early architecture of New York City and said that this was Cherry Street in 1797, you might believe them. This is London at the end of the 17th century. The Dutch way of building has become the London way of building. And London is so prestigious within the UK that the London way of building rapidly becomes the English way of building and the British way of building. The most beautiful row house cities, I think, is in England, the resort city of Bath, built in the middle years of the 18th century. If you happen to be a bird, you can experience the marvelous geometry of Bath with a crescent on one side, a circus on one side, a crescent on the other. All of this, the building blocks of this fabulous city, are row houses of moderate size, about the size of my house here in Baltimore. If you don't happen to be a bird, don't worry. The architecture of Bath is quite pleasant enough when you're walking around. You might look at this and say, is this a palace? Is this a public building? What is this? This is a row of houses built in the middle of the 18th century, not particularly large houses, but treated as great architecture and built beautifully and still there every day. And 2 blocks away from this is this. Again, if I told you that this was somebody's palace, if I said that the Empress Catherine the Great built this outside St. Petersburg, you might believe me. Don't believe me. This is a row of houses. This is the Royal Crescent in Bath. And each of the houses that compose this marvelous ensemble, this palatial ensemble, each of the individual houses is just an ordinary house, about the size of my house in Baltimore, no big deal. So the Dutch way is becoming the English way. And not just the English way, but the Scottish way. Here is the new town of Edinburgh. If you happen to be a bird, this is what it looks like. One of the great row house environments of the world, built on the model of Bath. It took 107 years to build, from 1770 to 1877. And medieval Edinburgh is marvelously wild and strange. But 18th century, 19th century Edinburgh is marvelously classical and orderly, with great sweeping circles and crescents. And then I hope, I assume that you're all writing books about something. You're in Greenwich Village after all. And as you do that, I hope that you will have pleasant surprises. The pleasantest surprise that I had was in the second biggest city of the British Empire in the 18th century. What was that? It was Dublin, Ireland. I didn't expect much from Dublin. Much of my ancestry is Irish, and I thought Ireland must have been a sad place. We were so anxious to leave. But Dublin is one of the great cities of the world. It is an Amsterdam-class city, and you can walk for hours in streets that look like this. Unlike the great row house streets of London and New York, they were never changed. Dublin wasn't bombed by the Luftwaffe, and it wasn't rich enough to tear things down and build bigger buildings. It's all still there, an extraordinary time capsule of the best of 18th century North Atlantic architecture. Well, by this time, of course, whoops, darn, I don't know why my computer isn't working tonight. It's not your fault. By this time, of course, the Dutch and the English are getting tired of being on only one side of the North Atlantic Ocean. They're starting to cross it, and they're starting to settle our side. They're building cities like Philadelphia. In Philadelphia, if you walk the old streets of Philadelphia, or even the new streets of Philadelphia, you will say Philadelphia is a row house city. Where did they get the idea for a city like this? I think that's pretty obvious. They got it from the other side of the pond. And they kept building row houses all through the 19th century. Some of the neighborhood of Rittenhouse, if you don't know it, is one of the great neighborhoods in the country, one of the great neighborhoods in the world. And I know New Yorkers like to tell jokes about Philadelphia, but Philadelphia is back on its feet and it has wonderful places in it. Then there is my town, Baltimore, which starts as a small town with wooden houses. There aren't a lot of wooden row houses in the world because most of them have burnt down, but we have a few of them. These were built in the middle of the 18th century. They were slummy when I was a kid. They are now painted up like racing yachts. And now we are a city of row houses. Here's the neighborhood in which I live. It's what I see when I walk my dog, or what I saw on some day in the springtime. And if you want to know what it is that is special about Baltimore row houses, we have quarries of white marble nearby, and the steps of our houses tend to be made of white marble. So so you've got Philadelphia, Baltimore. These are two cities in the London plan, and here's a third. Here's Beacon Hill in Boston. I had the pleasure of living in Beacon Hill when I was a graduate student, and what a pleasure it was. What a beautiful, beautiful place. But this is sort of early 19th century, very classical Georgian row house architecture. If you prefer Victorian, Boston's got that too. Here's the Back Bay of Boston, built between 1856 and about 1906, one of the great Victorian districts in the world, and a district of row houses. And then finally, New Amsterdam. If you want to know what 17th century American towns and cities looked like, that's hard because the British don't have a painting culture, but the Dutch do. And there are more 17th century pictures of New Amsterdam than there are of every other American town in the 17th century. Started by the Dutch, and look at all those Dutch gables. New Amsterdam must have looked something like the cover of my book, like Mr. Vermeer painting his Dutch gabled house. And you got off to a wonderful start as a North Atlantic city. And here really is Lower Broadway in 1828. Again, if somebody told you that this was a town in England or Holland, you'd probably say, okay, I believe that. This is your town. This is New York City. This is Lower Broadway from the Bowling Green, 1828. What a beautiful, beautiful street that is. What a beautiful curved street, beautifully framed street. What a lovely North Atlantic city this is, this New York. Here is New York's first residential square. London invented the residential square. Dublin has beautiful ones. New York built the first one in America, St. John's Square. And this is heartbreakingly beautiful. Why isn't this familiar to you? Why haven't you been there? Why don't you remember it? Well, I'm afraid your ancestors tore it all down. And if you've ever been stuck in traffic trying to get into the Holland Tunnel to go to New Jersey, that's where this is. All of this was torn down for that traffic spaghetti around Varick Street. But what a beautiful, beautiful start you got off to building squares in New York. This is 1825. 10 years later, the greatest of your squares, the greatest of America's squares, Washington Square. And some of it's still here. This is one of the great row house cities in the world. And then you New Yorkers do something that nobody else does. You figure out how to plate your houses with stone. And that, I guess, is why all of my cousins-in-law refer to row houses as brownstones. I think brownstones are really, really beautiful. I just wish it were a more durable material. Oh, well, you can't have everything. So by the middle of the 19th century, it was kind of looking as if New York was going to be a row house city forever. And everybody was just going to walk off arm in arm into the sunset and think how lucky they were to be living in a city that was like Amsterdam or London or Bath or Dublin. Well, didn't turn out that way. Fascinating. Here's an example of the change that occurred. This is a row of houses built in the 1830s in New York called London Terrace. Did they think they wanted their city to be like London? Well, apparently they thought it would help to sell houses. London Terrace, 3-story houses, tall steps like New York row houses. Where is this? Well, somehow London Terrace became the London Terrace Apartments. Um, a great example of the change that occurred in New York at the end of the 19th century and in the first half of the 20th century. New York somehow became a city of apartments, apartment buildings, and apartment dwellers. It got off to a good start of being like Amsterdam or London, but then your city decided to take a different road. And you did it magnificently, in my humble opinion, and that's a great part of the story of the North Atlantic cities. It is you New Yorkers who figured out how the rest of us in the North Atlantic world can live well in apartments. They never really figured that out in London and Amsterdam. You or your ancestors figured that out. And how they did so is quite a story. Humor me for a bit. Here's why you live. Oh, and it's perfectly visible if you want to know the difference between New York and London. Here is the center of London, fashionable London as seen from an airplane. What you're looking at is the London equivalent of Central Park, Hyde Park, and Kensington Gardens, surrounded by low buildings. There are a few buildings that really stand out. They're only 20 stories tall, but most of them are still row houses to this day. What is the New York equivalent? Boy, is that ever different. New York is a city very different from London today, a city of apartment houses, a city of high densities, a city with brilliant street life, a city with better food. Um, and how did it come to be that way? How is it that while Londoners, and this is about 1900, were building houses like this for working class people, New Yorkers were building tenements like this for working class people? How is this? How did this happen? Well, to understand it, you have to realize that up until really the beginning of the 20th century, almost everybody went everywhere on foot. And what this meant was, first of all, that the streets were pretty crowded, but second, that everybody had to live within about an hour's walk of where they worked. How far can a person walk? About 3 miles in an hour. So a city had to fit within 3 miles of wherever its job base happened to be. The job base of early New York was what we think of as Lower Manhattan. Why? Because that's where the Dutch built their fort. That's where they started New Amsterdam. And that was the job base of New York City, the only job base of New York City for a very long time. What you see in blue is some of the area, most of the area in New York that is within a 3 mile walk of that job base. You couldn't walk to Brooklyn, you couldn't walk to New Jersey. You had to walk straight up Manhattan Island, and you could only walk about 3 miles before it just took too long and you were too tired. That's New York. Here's London. London has two big job bases, the City of London for business and Westminster for government. But London doesn't have big, wide rivers. It just has the narrow little River Thames, which has lots of bridges on it and always had lots of cheap ferries. So when Londoners needed to live 3 miles away from work, they had much more land they could get to. How big was the land difference? Well, here's a comparison. You see the little amount of land that New Yorkers had on the left and the large double star that Londoners had on the right. They just had a lot more land that they could settle in. And as a result, New York, very early in the game, became much denser than London. Here's a graph showing New York and London population density. London is in blue. It has about 50,000 people per square mile. That's pretty dense. But New York in red has 160,000 people per square mile. And this isn't today, this is in 1850. This is a long time ago. And that's a lot of people per square mile. And New York is already 3 times denser than London. And if you want to know what it was like, there is a marvelous book called Manhattan for Rent, which will tell you this story. And it's pretty grim. People in New York by 1850, most people were living in one room. They needed to invent apartments, but they hadn't done it yet. What they did invent was public transportation. And public transportation helped them a lot. You and I can walk about 3 miles in an hour, but those horses can walk about 6 miles in an hour. And that meant that people could live 6 miles away from work. This was a help in New York. It meant that you could live you could live all the way up to the park pretty much. But it was even more of a help in London, where those two double star circles got bigger. So you still maintained this tremendous ratio where, New York by this time is as big as London, but it has much less land that people can live in. And so it becomes much more crowded than London. So New York, when it gets mass transit, becomes a little less dense. This is 1880. In 1850, it was 160,000 people per square mile. By 1880, it's down to 135,000 people per square mile, and that's a big improvement. But look at London. In 1850, London was 50,000 people per square mile. By 1880, it's down to 25,000. Big difference. Now, there was a lot of crowding in London. Here are the slums of Victorian London, and there are a lot of people living on top of each other. But they didn't have crowding a la New York. Here's crowding a la New York. And this is the densest set of neighborhoods, the densest urban environment that anyone in the North Atlantic world has ever built. And very, very, very different. Why? Because people had to live so close to their jobs. Whoops. Eventually, the subway made life dramatically easier for New Yorkers. New Yorkers could suddenly go all kinds of distance, and they did. But by that time, New Yorkers were already used to living in apartments. Developers were delighted to build more of them, and you get places like this. This is the Grand Concourse in the Bronx. London also built a subway, equally ambitious, but Londoners were not used to living in apartments. So when you rode out on the London Underground, you rapidly got to neighborhoods that look like this. This is the London equivalent of the outer boroughs of New York. And basically a series of garden cities going on forever with 5 million people living in. So where does that leave you? Here is Washington Square in the 1920s. Here you are in Greenwich Village. Your neighborhood has the most fascinating history, really does. It's great. I mean, I don't need to tell you that. You live in Greenwich Village. But you also, this is something that probably nobody has ever told you, you live at the absolute center of the North Atlantic tradition. You are par excellence the place that has first-rate examples of everything that any of us have ever done in building cities in the North Atlantic world. What do I mean by that? You have, to start with, beautiful row house neighborhoods and streets, just, none better anywhere except maybe Bath. You have that, but you don't stop there. You have the New York innovations, for better or worse, of tenement housing. You have that too, and some of you probably live in it. You have a little bit of everything. You have the great New York innovation of the skyscraper and high-rise housing, and you don't have too much of it. And I know you're in a big fight now, and I wish I were one of your residents so I could join you in your fight. I think you're right. Go get de Blasio here. I'm a good Democrat, but go get him. He's wrong. You're right. And you've got a bit of everything. You've got some of the best useful and ornamental retail in the country or in the world, almost like Paris. And you've got what is, I think, the greatest square, this great London innovation in the square. You've got the greatest square in North America. What makes it great? You make it great. The way you use it, the way you live in it. It is your marvelous outdoor living room, a fabulous, fabulous place. And so here we all are, you, I, my dog who's asleep on the floor over here. in the North Atlantic cities. Four little words that you've never heard before. But if you ever hear them again, I hope now you'll know what people are talking about. The cities on the two coasts of the North Atlantic, the cities that begin in the age of Vermeer by building row houses out of brick that look like something nice, but don't stop there and wind up at Greenwich Village. And God bless them. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Charlie. I love the events that we have where we get to fly out of Greenwich Village and see the ways that it's connected to so many other places in the world. It's such a delight.
They're connected to you. You're the center of it.
We like to think so, for sure.
I've only lived it once in Greenwich Village, and that was in a summer sublet. But boy, I liked it.
It's a pretty great place.
Yep.
Oh, we're getting lots of thanks. Thanks, folks, for being here. We have just a couple of questions, but if folks have more, please do put them in the Q&A. Karen wants to know, is there any current building happening on the row house model and where?
Oh, my heaven. There are boatloads of row houses getting built all over the North Atlantic world all the time. My favorite is a brand new suburb of Rotterdam called Berkel-Westpolder. And if you invite me back, I will show you. I didn't invent the Dutch language. It's not my fault. You're New Amsterdam, but Dutch is a funny language. Berkel-Westpolder is, I think, the best place to be a young family with young kids that I've ever been in. It is a row house town that's still under construction, and you can get to downtown Rotterdam in 12 minutes on an excellent subway. But my neighbors here in Baltimore are building row houses at the rate of 3,000 a year on average. It's an absolutely standard building type. It's a standard suburban building type. If you're curious, it's a standard suburban building type now in Houston. There are new row houses popping up all over the place in Houston. It's a row house. It's a building type that's come back. I'd love to walk you around Baltimore Harbor. Baltimore Harbor was just a working waterfront when I was growing up, but it's now pretty fully gentrified. And it has a lot of apartments and condominiums, but it also has a lot of row houses built out on piers and very Dutch. So row houses are alive and well. And I think people are beginning to realize that they're a good sort of a both and solution, that you can have a nice house to live in and decent street life within easy walking distance.
Yeah, we have a comment from Brian who also pointed out that Philadelphia has many modern row homes, which is
Indeed
great.
It does.
Yeah, so wonderful.
Thanks. Go
for
up to
that,
Northern
Brian.
Liberties and you'll see a lot of experimental row house designs in Philadelphia.
Nikki wants to know, is Highland Town a row house neighborhood? I don't know where that is.
Highland Town is in East Baltimore.
Okay.
And it is the authoritative Baltimore row house neighborhood. White marble steps and everything. Yep.
Yeah, so many.
It's a blue collar neighborhood that used to be famous for people scrubbing their white marble steps to keep them clean. Nobody does that anymore because we don't burn coal anymore, and the white marble doesn't get dirty the way it used to.
Thank goodness for that on a lot of levels.
Yeah, and the neighborhood is now half yuppies and half Latinos. It's a very interesting place. Great place to play soccer.
Oh my gosh, so many questions. Michael and Mitchell are asking about row houses in Chicago and in Scandinavian countries.
As for row houses in Chicago, there are a fair number of them. And I could have spent more time with Chicago than I did. My mistake. I hope Chicagoans love their architecture, and I hope they'll start pounding on my door and saying, let me in. I'd be glad to do that. And as for Scandinavian architecture, let's go. I've never been there. Let's go. Show me what I've missed. Sure, there's a lot. Except here's why I didn't. Because the book that turned me on to this was a book basically written in praise of London in 1928. London, the unique city, written by a Danish architect. And he spends the whole book talking about how beautifully Londoners build and how much fun it is to live in London compared to how horrible Copenhagen is with all these dark, crowded apartments. So I thought Copenhagen's probably not part of the story. But every now and then I look at Google Earth and I'm thinking maybe Copenhagen's part of the story. Besides, everybody seems to love it. Let's go.
I hear that too. Questions about Baltimore, I think. Nikki wants to know, is Highland Town a row house neighborhood? The Greek side of my family lived there 60 or 70 years ago. And Tish is assuming that you live in Bolton Hill. She lives on Tyson Street.
Well, first of all, I'm glad for anybody who had Greek ancestors in Highland Town. I had a lot of fun building an apartment building with a fraternal organization of Greek Americans. And it's just a really interesting community, great fun to work with. And Tish from Tyson Street got me in one. Come see me in the 200 block of West Landale Street in Bolton Hill.
Amazing. I love that we've got folks from all over the place in the room with us tonight. Thank you everyone for being here. Michael wants to know, since you mentioned Richmond, could you speak a little bit about that as a place that is further inland? Michael is here with us from Richmond.
Well, Richmond is the westernmost of the Atlantic cities. It's physically a little bit, I don't know, it's probably not west of Baltimore, but they're both fall line cities. They're as far as you can get in a seagoing boat at some time in history. Richmond's a little bit, is to some extent the newest of the American North Atlantic cities. It is, in my humble opinion, the prettiest of the American North Atlantic cities, except for Savannah, Georgia, which is in a class by itself. Richmond is I just love it. It is, and the Richmond of today is more remarkable than any historical Richmond. The city is well governed. It's dealing with its racial past in a very interesting way. And it's growing by 1% a year. You New Yorkers are building a lot, but your population is more or less stable. Richmond is the fastest growing of the North Atlantic cities, except for Washington, D.C., which doesn't count. That's because we keep electing people who are going to make government smaller. If you're from Richmond, you have friends and relations who are doing some pretty wonderful things.
Thanks. Gordon wanted to know how to spell the name of the Rotterdam district.
BERKEL space WESTPOLDER.
Wow.
I can send it to you, and if you want, Ariel, I can send you some pictures of it if you wanted to distribute it to people.
Oh, I would love to.
It doesn't look like Greenwich Village. It looks like a little Dutch town, except that it's brand new.
Amazing.
It's a living tradition.
Yeah, I can include that in our follow-up email after the talk.
And Rotterdam, if you walk around Leiden or Delft or even parts of Amsterdam, you can feel that you're walking around in the 17th century. Not Rotterdam. Rotterdam, you feel as if you were walking around in Houston, except it isn't hot and there aren't any cars. Rotterdam got bombed by the Nazis in 1940, and it's a completely modern city with giant skyscrapers in the middle, and fancy name architects like Calatrava, and it's an extraordinary mix.
Yeah, New York is lucky to have some Calatrava too.
New York is lucky.
That's a true fact. And
Yeah.
actually, Bill wanted to just clarify, when you said New York in the 1850s, you probably were talking about just Manhattan, right?
I was talking about just Manhattan because it's, yes, because Brooklyn certainly had happened before the 1850s, uh, but it didn't yet have massive job bases. It got them eventually. And the ferries, Walt Whitman's poem about the Brooklyn ferries is one of my favorite poems.
So
But the
beautiful.
Brooklyn ferries cost 5 cents each way, and working class people couldn't afford to ride them. They were just for middle class people. Working class people really got hammered in New York until the subways. It took the subway to make New York a decent place to be a working class person.
Yeah, yeah, and it's interesting. I have a question from Susan about the poorer neighborhoods in Baltimore. How do those compare? Are there row houses there? What is
Oh
that
yeah,
like?
oh yeah. The poorest neighborhoods in any American city tend to be old and close to the center of town. Um, and in the North Atlantic cities, the old neighborhoods close to the centers of town tend to have row houses. Um, I mean, New York's a bit of an exception because New York's an exception to lots of things. But, Baltimore and Philadelphia, the slum neighborhoods tend to be row house neighborhoods. Same in St. Louis, same in Pittsburgh. St. Louis and Pittsburgh have torn down a higher percentage of them than Baltimore and Philadelphia have. And then the slum neighborhoods of Washington used to be row house neighborhoods, but now Washington doesn't have any slum neighborhoods anymore.
Hmm.
Um, some of the worst slum neighborhoods in Baltimore are architecturally and urbanistically identical to some of the best neighborhoods in town. They just happen to be in a place with a different history.
So interesting. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you
And
for
that's why it's fun to be me. I get to figure out how to help people rebuild their neighborhoods and how to rebuild houses, and it's fun. I just wish I could live 4,000 years so I could do the whole city of Baltimore.
So, can you tell us a little bit more about the book, about its structure? Can you hold it up again for us?
Hold it up.
Some
And,
folks are
and like
asking.
Amazon, I can show you imitations. It
Oh,
has,
it looks beautiful.
it is beautiful. It's beautiful graphic design. It's just, oh, there's Queen Elizabeth,
Oh, hello.
London in 1600. It's a beautiful piece of work. My publisher is in the UK and is a publisher of art books. And it never occurred to me that he would want to publish a book about architecture, but he is my man in Liverpool. Liverpool's certainly one of the North Atlantic cities. I didn't know anybody there. I read a book about it. I wanted to communicate with the author, so I sent an email to the publisher. The publisher said, "Well, I'm sorry, the author died 2 years ago. Can I help you?" So we became friends by email. And then, when I went over to Liverpool, he showed me around and we became family friends. And my wife and I stay in his house. And finally, the book was done. And I said, "Gee, Alan, how'd you like to publish a book?" He said, "Why not?" So there you go. And so here's a book about cities that's published by a press that deals in art photography. Needless to say, it looks a heck of a lot better than I ever thought it would.
Oh, that's so wonderful. I'm so glad.
And I was
Folks are
afraid that I would have, that the pictures would cost too much and I could only have four or something like that. They do art photography. They know how to do it. The book has 185 pictures. And
Wow.
I said, I was working with a graphic designer and I said, "Michael, it really would be helpful to have a picture here." And he said, "Well, send me one." Well, okay, sure. Sure.
That's great.
Yeah.
Folks are also asking about the Manhattan for Rent book, which
Yeah.
actually I just Googled it and I'm seeing it here. And I'm gonna put the link for that into the chat as well, folks, so that you can take a look at that and get the name of the author.
Blackmar, Blackmar, I believe, isn't it?
Oh, great.
Elizabeth Blackmar, I believe.
Yes, that's right. Cool.
A very good book. I mean, not a page turner. I mean, it's serious history, and the story it tells isn't a very happy story. It's a story about how lots of people lived badly, and then 10 years later, they lived even worse.
Oh, gosh.
But it's a story.
I mean, facts are still facts, and it's important to learn them.
Yeah.
Yeah. We have one. I'm going to have this be our last question from Thomas. Would you describe, the Place des Vosges in Paris as an example of row house architecture?
Sure would. And better is hard to find. And if I had been running Paris in the 17th century, I would have said, thank you, King Henry IV. You have shown us how to build a city. Let's go. But the people who were building Paris didn't do that. The Place des Vosges turned out to be a one-off. Then 20 years later, the first London residential square was built. That's Covent Garden, which is now a shopping mall. And that turned out not to be a one-off. So Paris has Place des Vosges and come to think of it, it has the Place des Vosges. And I believe the London A to Z has 223 places that are called square or crescent or place or something else that means basically the same thing. Not a one-off in London. And if you're wondering why, there's this lovely book that explains why. It's called The North Atlantic Cities.
That's beautiful. And I'm going to use one of our attendees' words to close us off this evening. This is from BJ, who says, "This was just a brilliant talk, amazingly insightful connections between mobility, population density, and how that dictated trends in housing. My wish is that when this devastation of COVID finally ends, that you can come to New York City and present this talk to a large live audience who will buy tons of books." So I don't think I could wrap it up any better.
Yes, I'll stand on top of the arch in Washington Square. Yes.
That sounds great. We can't wait to have you.
Stadium Rock comes to urban history. Yes.
I'm into it. I'm ready for it, but we will be patient, and in the meantime, thank you so much for joining us on Zoom. It's just such a pleasure to be able to connect with you from Baltimore to New York to London, all the folks who are here with us. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And when this pandemic is over, this is an introductory talk on the book Custom Tailored for New Yorkers. But there are lots of stories in this book, and some of them make decent talks. I'd love to see you all in person.
Oh, that sounds great. Thank you.
Good.
Thank you so
Thank you.
much. And thank
Great.
you to everyone who's here with us and who joined us. Keep an eye out for our follow-up email. We're recording this. Feel free to share it with your friends. And buy some books.
Buy some books. Buy some books.
Take good care, everyone, and keep warm. Good night.
Good night. Thank you.